I think this is kind of the picture of what China is doing. They see Russia is a very needy country right now. They need friends, big friends. They need trading partners, etc., etc. And Russia is a pretty pliable cooperating party for the Chinese, and I think the Chinese are masterfully maneuvering in order to take advantage when they can.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by General Philip Breedlove, a highly decorated four-star general who served for 39 years. He was Commander of US European Command, as well as Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO Allied Command Operations. General Breedlove, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
It's good to be back. I love this format.
Before we get into the war in Ukraine specifically, and we're also going to touch on last week's NATO summit in Washington, I just wanted to get your reaction, first of all, to the big story from the weekend, which was the horrific attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Clearly, he's an incredibly divisive political figure, but regardless of your politics, I mean, it was a truly shocking moment. As an American, I just wonder what your reaction is.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. And I think that this is bigger than politics. I think we survived a brush with catastrophe, no matter whether you like him or not. Assassination of a president is no way to affect change in this world. And setting a precedent that one would accept that as a way of changing business is horrific. And how does that then affect the next generation of people? Our nation is nearly completely evenly divided these days on views that are conservative versus views that are very liberal, and there's always going to be an enormous number of people in our nation that don't agree with the elected leadership. But the fact of the matter is we have to function. We have to, if you'll allow me, high function, I believe, in this country, because we have a lot of responsibility to the world. And frankly, we should be setting examples for the world. And right now we're setting the wrong example for the world out there. So I am very happy that we didn't end up with a much more disastrous result. And I think that this is a wake-up call of immense proportion. I do like the way that former President Trump and our current president have handled this so far, and that is, rather than trying to score a bunch of political points left or right, there seems to be a certain amount of calm and less vitriol coming out of former President Trump. And we see much the same out of our current president. He seems to have come off some of the harshness of the campaign rhetoric and is asking for our nation to find a better way forward on this. And if that happens, this near disaster will serve a positive result. If we allow this to spiral us into more divisive positioning politically in our country, then it's just not going to serve our country well. So my prayer is that we don't see this as the first of more than one attempts to affect change by assassination. It's just not the tool.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, General, for addressing that. Let's come on to the substance of last week's NATO summit in Washington. Ukraine signed a series of security agreements and received several aid packages, including a pledge of long-term security assistance for Ukraine of at least 40 billion euros within the next year. There were also bilateral security agreements with Romania, Luxembourg and Poland, $250 million of military aid from Australia, and also negotiations are ongoing with Czechia, Ireland and Slovenia about further bilateral agreements. What, if any, difference do you think those agreements and that military aid will make on the front line?
Well, let's address the elephant in the room first, and then we'll back into answering your question. What did not happen is beginning a process of making Ukraine a part of NATO, which is, in my estimation, what it will take in the future to absolutely secure Ukraine's peaceful existence in Russia in Europe. I do not believe that anything short of NATO membership will stop Mr. Putin in Ukraine. I think that what we're watching in Ukraine, what we're watching in Georgia, and what we're watching in Moldova, in Transnistria and other districts of Moldova, this is the future with Russia. Russia has been told over and over and over by the West that the West will defend every inch of NATO territory. What does Mr. Putin hear when he hears that? Everything else is fair game. And that's where he is now. He's existing in all the spaces outside of NATO. He's pushing his agenda in these spaces. And he clearly gets it. NATO's going to defend NATO, and NATO's not going to defend non-NATO. And I think that we have made a huge mistake in the West in the way we message Mr. Putin. He is not deterred in spaces outside of NATO spaces. I believe he is deterred, at least to a certain degree, inside of NATO spaces. Kinetically, he is deterred. But what we see, you see it in London all the time, Mr. Putin is active in NATO states in the gray zone or the hybrid zone. Murders, all the things that he is doing to affect Russian policies and Russian advantage, he's doing inside NATO spaces below the line of kinetics. I believe he is deterred at the line of kinetics. So, sorry for getting off the point, but we need to always kind of keep our eyes up on the horizon and understand that what did not happen at the Washington summit is the beginning of a process that results in Ukraine being a part of NATO.
Although just to jump in on that very briefly, General, sorry to interrupt. Whilst we're on that topic, they did declare in the summit declaration at the end that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. But you're skeptical about that, are you?
No, I'm not skeptical. I actually believe that. But here's what I think needs to be understood. We are deterred. Mr. Putin is dictating our policies towards Ukraine. Just like Georgia, for decades now, every summit, we've come up with a new set of adjectives to describe our relationship with Georgia. All of them short of offering Georgia membership in NATO. And so we're kind of on the same path with Ukraine. Every time we have a summit, we come up with a new set of words, a new set of adjectives, a new set of qualifiers that talk about our relationship with Ukraine. But all of them are short of membership because we are deterred. We will not do that right now because Mr. Putin has made his veto. His veto is he amassed his land army. He crossed an internationally recognized border. He invaded a country. And now, because he is occupying portions of that country, NATO is not going to offer a NATO membership. That's Mr. Putin's veto. He understands it well. We understand our part of the game. We will continue to use these words to describe what we're doing to try to assure Ukraine, but we will stay short of what Mr. Putin has vetoed. And so I think that, again, I just want to be extremely thankful and acknowledge all that did happen for Ukraine at this summit. It's all good, it's all needed. Some of it is grossly late, but we did get some good things done. But we have to be intellectually honest and acknowledge that we are deterred. We have not Mr. Offered Ukraine and Mr. Zelensky what they really want, because Mr. Putin has cast his veto, and we are not going to challenge that veto.
And just to go back to some of those security agreements that were announced, I mean, almost to go back to our original question about Donald Trump, I mean, some people were talking about this being a summit to Trump-proof NATO if he were to return to the White House and potentially withdraw support for Ukraine. Is the 40 billion euros that was announced really going to be enough if, for example, the US pulls military aid?
Okay, I want to ask you to remind me of that question in a minute, because I want to answer a little different question. How many troops left Europe during Mr. Trump's presidency?
I don't know. You tell me.
The answer is our troop presence grew in Europe during Mr. Trump's presidency. And now while I have been very vocal about how bad the tactics, techniques, and procedures that he uses are, how many nations were giving 2% to their military before President Trump?
Well, not very many and not enough. And I think actually even people who have been very critical of Donald Trump would agree with you on that.
Exactly. So here's the point. For all of the, again, maybe poor tactics, techniques, and procedures that President Trump used, and we have to be intellectually honest again and say, he and Mr. Putin changed the face of NATO, and the U.S. commitment to Europe grew under President Trump. And so, while I worry about the same thing that our NATO brothers and sisters worry about, we fared well despite all of the pain and the hard rhetoric. NATO did just fine under the first Trump presidency. And I do worry about how he may approach Europe in a second presidency. But I do not worry about NATO folding. I do not worry about the United States leaving. The idea of quote unquote Trump proofing NATO, I think it engenders a good conversation, but I don't take the same issue as maybe those who want to Trump proof NATO. I think a better way forward is to understand that he does have some less than perfect international skills in how he deals with people, but I don't argue against embracing the fact that nations need to invest in their own defense. Remember, that's what Article 3 is. When I was a SAC year, I used to boil it down into what I called Georgia boy speak, which is Article 3 means defense begins at home. Build a military to defend yourself and build capabilities beyond that in order to contribute to the welfare of the alliance and the defense of your allies. And so once again, you don't have to Google very far to find out I was fairly critical of the way President Trump handled NATO. But in the end, if we look at results, we did not fare horribly during his first 4 years.
Well, maybe Trump-proofing NATO isn't the way of looking at it. Maybe it's more about Trump-proofing support for Ukraine and Ukraine's war effort. Because if Trump comes in and says no more US military aid, this is going to be a huge commitment required from Europe and from other NATO member states. And do you think they are getting to the point, General, where they have the political will to do that without America?
Uh, no, but may I just say that they are much farther along and better off than they were 2 years ago. I actually am a fan, and I speak fondly of where NATO is headed in this regard. Senior leaders are stepping up. Um, um, uh, President Macron really, I think, surprised NATO in the way that he got on this bandwagon and said, "We got to take care of this." And so, and what I call the Eastern Flank nations, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, these nations, in American slang, have gotten religion, and they are on this job, and they are leading others to be on this job. And so I think that there is progress here, and that the nations get it and see what their responsibilities are, and they're stepping toward them rather than away from them. Now, may I just say, and I'm not trying to be too critical, but I lived 5 times in Germany. Two of my daughters were born in Deutschland. And I remember serving in Germany during the height of the Cold War. My first tour in Germany, I was with the U.S. Army on the inter German border with 2nd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division. And I remember the Bundeswehr of the Cold War. I remember the Luftwaffe of the Cold War. And I hope and I pray all the time that Deutschland will step up to its leadership role, both financially and in policy, towards Mr. Putin and Ukraine. If you had, there are amazing nations in NATO, but if the Poland's, the UK's, the France, the Germany's of NATO set their mind to preparing for this, it would be demonstrative what NATO could do.
I thought one of the other really interesting things to come out of the NATO summit was the leaders using their strongest language yet to condemn China's role in regards to the war in Ukraine. Officially, Beijing would say it's neutral, but no one really believes that, and they've called them a decisive enabler of Putin's war, demanding China cease the shipment of weapons, components, and other parts to Russia. How significant is that, General?
Well, may I add one more twist to that? If you're following the same reporting I am, there are Chinese exercising in Belarus. Um, uh, so this is well beyond the conversation level of China's involvement in this business. If China is running around on the Polish border in Belarus or places like that, exercising, we are at a new phase of how this works. Listen, China's going to deny that it's sending weapons or technologies or whatever to Russia, but I think that plays well to their internal audience. It doesn't play well to the learned folks outside of their internal audience. And I think that China is an extremely shrewd partner of Russia and Mr. Putin. I think that China is masterful at getting what they need from Mr. Putin. And I wouldn't go as far as some pundits or some people who write and say that, Russia has become the little brother in this arrangement. I don't know that that's appropriate, but what is clear is China is not there just out of the goodwill of their thoughts. They have expectations. They are maneuvering Russia to accomplish things that they want to accomplish, and to sort of restrict Russia in some cases. I point back to during my time as the SACIR when Russia invaded Crimea and then Russia invaded the Donbass. I think that they were surprised by world reaction. And if you remember, they reached out to China to establish this picture of cooperation, and they gave China this huge oil deal, which really the pipeline was only completed a couple of years ago and started flowing this oil. And China abused Russia in that oil deal. And Russia is losing money every day on that oil deal. And I think this is kind of the picture of what China is doing. They see Russia as a very needy country right now. They need friends, big friends. They need trading partners, etc., etc. And Russia is a pretty pliable cooperating party for the Chinese, and I think the Chinese are masterfully maneuvering in order to take advantage when they can.
So, what should the West's response be? I mean, other than upping the rhetoric and calling out China more publicly, as the NATO leaders did last week, you could talk about sanctions. There are already sanctions in place. You could have more, but are they really going to make an impact? Is there anything the West could do to try and peel away Xi Jinping from Vladimir Putin?
So, sanctions in China are a slippery slope. As you know, much like a lot of Western Europe, and still are, but a lot more of them were almost completely dependent on Russian oil. You have to be careful not to bite too hard the hand that feeds. If you are dependent on Russian energy, it becomes a little hard to impact them. The United States, certainly, and to a degree also Europe, is dependent on Chinese trade, Chinese investment, Chinese this, that, and the other. And so the West has to be careful, because when you make yourself dependent on someone, they have the ability to affect your future. And right now, many of the tools we might want to use against China are not helpful because we are so dependent on them in many ways. And so while we can take certain actions and we can do certain uh, um, sanctions or trade restrictions or whatever to bring pressure on China, the most important thing to do is become less dependent on China. Okay? Just like some Americans tried to lecture Western Europe about oil dependency on Russia, we need to look in the mirror and lecture ourselves on being dependent on China. We need to get back in the business of doing things that we are dependent on China. And I've seen the numbers all over the place, but a very high percentage, over 90% or high 80% of the rights to the world's rare earths are held by China. We need to make ourselves less dependent on those rare earths, and we need to find our own sources of those rare earths, because China has a huge fulcrum of leverage to maneuver the West if the West gets too boisterous in their dealing with China. So I didn't give you any answers. I think we can use the tools of sanctions and things around the margin, but I don't think that we're going to find our way to anything that is demonstrative, because we are dependent on China. We have put ourselves in this bad situation.
And just finally, General, zooming out a bit and looking at where the lay of the land is in regards to the war in Ukraine in July 2024, as someone who obviously wants to see Ukraine win, how are you feeling about their prospects currently? It's been a difficult start of the year with the Russian offensive and with delays in Western military aid. How are you feeling currently? How do you see the state of play?
Well, let me point the finger right straight at us. The fact that we gapped their supply in a political struggle inside my country is embarrassing. It is embarrassing. And we need to sort ourselves. in order to not see that ever happen again, because our political embarrassment resulted in the death of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian men, women, and children, and the loss of Ukrainian land. Let me just say that one more time so we can understand sort of the personal pronouns involved here. Our mismanagement resulted in the loss of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, men, women, and children, and Ukrainian land. That's a really sad state of affairs. And so, what we see in general, excuse me, when we equip Ukraine correctly, they win. How this war ends is 100% a matter of Western policy. If we choose to give Ukraine what they need to win, they will win. We are not giving them what they need to win because we are deterred. Mr. Putin's most effective weapon is his war of intimidation, his war of words. He has convinced most of the current set of Western leadership that his nearly weekly reference to something nuclear and his constant references to widening the war, etc., 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 these all have deterred decision makers of the West. And we desperately need to rethink policy and move forward. Again, Ukraine's not asking for our people. They're asking for our support. I would ask you, as a journalist, to go look at the cost of World War I or World War II on a daily basis, rationalized forward to today's dollars. Look at what a couple of days in the war cost during battles. Battle of the Bulge, D-Day, and you name it. There's a whole bunch of times. Compare the cost of a day of fighting that war to what the West has done for Ukraine so far. We do not want to pay the cost of another war. What we're investing now is well below the costs of wars. And so I think we need to be really thinking when we decide not to support Ukraine.
General Breedlove, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.